Hi, good morning, everyone. So thank you for coming to our media review. So I think today we have a very interesting topic. So I've heard many of you know what are the Asian tigers of the past. So from the 1960s to the 1990s, four Asian tigers emerged, namely Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan, as they undergo tremendous growth and rapid industrialization on the back of a strong exports growth. And since then, these Asian tigers have taken a backseat as another economic miracle emerged, the Asian dragon, also known as China. So now that the Asian dragon is taking a breather, with China experiencing a slowdown in economic growth, I'm sure investors are curious, what are some of the new Asian tigers in mind? So with this in mind, let us dive into our discussion today and ask our esteemed and panel speakers what they think are some of the opportunities in Asia. So the first question, why not we ask Grace? So what do you think are some of the Asian tigers of today?
Okay, so I think previously the Asian tigers, as you mentioned, the four different countries, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So they were driven by exports, high savings rates, and those has driven growth. But today we think that growth, I think, is driven a lot by consumption as well. So we have the big tigers, China, India, and we also have the emerging tiger cubs, so like Indonesia as well as Vietnam. So I think the story for China and India is kind of well known. So looking more at Indonesia and Vietnam, so do you know that Indonesia is actually the fourth largest, most populous country in the world? And it also has the largest GDP in Southeast Asia. And Vietnam is also an emerging power. So by 2025, we actually expect Vietnam to be the third largest power in terms of GDP in Southeast Asia as well. So we think overall, Asia does have the best of both worlds. So first, we have a huge population. So 60% of the world's population actually lives in Asia. And secondly, we also have a huge consuming class. So if you look at by 2030, actually half the population, or more than half the population actually, will be in the consuming class. So we think that these are big drivers for growth in Asia. And actually, we also do think that rather than just limiting yourself to four countries, we also can look at small emerging tiger cubs that are present in Asia as well. For example, in Korea, we have HPSP, which is this small cap company. And what's interesting about the company is that it is the sole manufacturer of high-pressure hydrogen annealing equipment. And what's special about this equipment is that it supports high node for semiconductor manufacturing. So, and this is important because we need high node manufacturing for chips, because those are driven by, those will support AI server growth as chips as well. So we do think there's a lot of opportunity in Asia. So yeah, overall, we think that there's huge growth and potential as well.
Thank you, Hilda. So a nice name. So China, India, as well as Indonesia and Vietnam. So why don't we ask Hilda next? What do you think are some of your Asian tigers in mind?
Sure, thanks. So similar to what Grace has mentioned, I think if we're to think about the Asian tigers from a more original set of economies, they were actually driven, or their fast growth was driven very much by industrialization, exports, to a certain extent also education. So in this time of the day, I would say the growth drivers might be a bit different, but if you were to ask me what are some economies where I expect very high growth potential, in my mind, I would think Vietnam, India, and also Indonesia. So these are countries or economies which actually has already experienced very fast growth even before the pandemic. So take Vietnam, for example, I would say I would expect manufacturing to be a key driver of their growth. Increasingly, I see Vietnam as kind of like an outsourcing destination of choice for many companies who want to outsource their manufacturing facilities, whether it's to diversify their manufacturing facilities away from China or away from developed markets. As for India and Indonesia, I think a key strength of theirs is that they have a young and growing population. So their middle income population is actually growing and will be a huge driver of domestic demand for them. So that itself is a very strong structural growth. Particularly for India, I think the government has been very supportive of the digital and technology sectors. So that would likely be a very strong source of growth for the economy. And of course, last but not least, for Indonesia, it also has rich natural resources. So in Indonesia, it's the largest, it has the world's largest nickel reserve, and that is likely going to be a key reason that helps to propel them as the electric vehicle battery producer or leading one within the world.
Thank you, Hilda. How about you, Oliver?
I would concur with both the prior speakers. I think Korea and Taiwan are for sure going to continue their manufacturing prowess, especially in the technology space. So I would consider them tigers for the next decade or so. I think Singapore and Hong Kong have matured, so maybe you're going to see slightly lower growth rates. So from a manufacturing perspective, I would expect things like Vietnam and Thailand, which is a big auto parts manufacturer, to actually step up and deliver decent growth over the next sort of 10 years or so. That's looking at it through one lens of manufacturing. If I look at it through more of a domestic economy perspective, and that's where I think the real opportunity is, you need to look at countries that have big populations, young dynamic populations, low credit to GDP, and that's India, Indonesia, and probably Vietnam. So there's different lenses you can look at and different definitions for tigers, but for sure, Asia's an exciting place to invest. And there's lots of opportunity. I personally work on a Japan desk. Now, Japan definitely isn't an Asia tiger. It's more of a mature market, but it is the third biggest economy in the world. And it can definitely be a gateway into Asia for international companies. And it has a lot of manufacturing itself. So as we diversify supply chains away from China, Japan can for sure benefit. So Japan's in a good place, not a tiger in itself, but can definitely exploit some of the opportunities we're seeing in Asia.
Thank you. Some new names are Thailand and Japan. So last but not least, let's ask Kenny, what do you think are some of the Asian tigers of today?
Yeah, I have to say that my list of the Asian tiger is slightly different from the other panelists. So my choice of Asian tigers is Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, which is our country. So I think it's important to understand why, I would call this the Asian tigers. So some of the criteria that I have kind of like established to choose the new choice of Asian tigers, I think first of all, I think it's important to also understand that, the world has changed. There's a shifting geopolitics, the kind of standoff that you see between US and China definitely has important ramification on the Asian landscape. So who are the beneficiary for this shifting geopolitics? I think it's important criteria. The second criteria which I would use is a lot of people in the past would deem that high economic growth would be the key to kind of like criteria to basically deem yourself as an Asian tiger. For me, I would rather use the word sustainable economic growth. Sustainable economic growth not necessarily mean high economic growth. So like, Japan for the past 2-3 decades, the growth has been terrible. I was in Japan, interestingly, working in Japan in the early 90s when the bubble just burst. At that point in time, the valuation of the Japanese market prior to the burst of the Japanese economy was more than 100 times. A lot of companies are in big corporate debt. So, but I think over the past 2 decades, what we have seen in a number of the Asian economies is that countries like Japan, countries like South Korea, countries like Singapore, they have been saving quite a bit. If you look at the corporate, the so-called the country balance sheet, one of the key indicators you look at is the current account surplus. So these 3 countries have been consistently achieving a very high current account surplus. So I think that is important because you don't have a good savings behind you. I mean, how can you sustain your economic growth going into the future? Because you can't just spend all the way on your reserves. So I think that is one of the other criteria. The third criteria, which I think is important, is the availability of world-class brand. I mean, you don't call yourself a tiger if nobody knows about you. So if only people knows about you through growth, then I think that is a very simplistic way of calling yourself a tiger. You look at Japan, they have world-class brands, Toyota, Sony, and a lot of the other brands that you think about, everybody knows. You talk to everyone in the world. And secondly, like Korea, you have your Hyundai, your Kia. It used to be very cheap cars, but now I know it's no longer that cheap. It's actually gone into the league to compete directly with the Japanese car. And the likes of Samsung, I mean, those people who don't hold Apple most probably will hold a Samsung phone. And I think the last but not least, Singapore, of course, you also have your Singapore Airlines, which is always the best airline in the world. And you also have your esteemed DBS Bank, who has been voted like world best bank for, I think, twice. So I think those are some of the criteria that I would call it important. So in summary, it's Japan, South Korea, and Singapore.
Right, so we do have some consensus on the countries, of course, some differences. So I think moving on to the next question, I think directed to Grace. So, in the past, the manufacturing sector has always been the driver for the 4 Asian tigers of the past. And in this day and age where technology is a key driving force for many nations, do you still agree that manufacturing prowess is the key factor for a country to succeed?
So we do think that manufacturing is important, but it's not the key factor. I mean, today we are seeing high-end manufacturing moved out from developed markets and low-end manufacturing moving more to emerging markets. So we do think that there are other factors in play, such as consumption. So like I mentioned, the big countries like India, Vietnam, Indonesia, they are huge populous countries. So consumption would help to drive growth as well. And just, I think, zooming on technology. So moving there, we know that R&D and patents are important. So when we look at South Korea and Taiwan, or more South Korea, I guess. So if you look at their patents in terms of AI and DRAM, so Hynix, SK Hynix as well as Samsung Electronics, they actually have 90% market share in terms of AI DRAM. So having IT is important as well. And not only just on IT, but also in terms of big data. So we think, for example, China actually has benefited given its huge population because they are able to get a huge data set to analyze. So companies like TikTok actually have benefited a lot from this huge data set because they have an algorithm that learns about you every 2 seconds, right? So TikTok probably knows you better than even your own mother. So so basically, because of all these big data consumption, we think that all these will help to drive growth. And one interesting fact as well is that China is actually the #1 in terms of AI patents globally filed. So they've even overtaken the US. So, we think there's definitely a lot of growth in Asia, and manufacturing, I think, is not the kind of key only factor, but there are other factors as well that would drive growth.
Right, so I think, how about you, Oliver? Japan is quite a strong manufacturer of many cars, etc. What do you think about Japan?
Yeah, so I think manufacturing is important. I think 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was probably the most important driver. Going forward, I think it's going to be the combination of technology alongside manufacturing. And Japan is in a pretty good place here. It has a long heritage of basic manufacturing, like materials, but also higher-end manufacturing. Used to be 50% of the semiconductor industry back in the 1980s. But as I look at Japan today, the labor force is actually reasonably cheap, very highly skilled. They've got big brand names, which the prior speaker alluded to. So I think they are going to be in a good place for the next decade to benefit from some of these drivers as technology increasingly permeates the factories and the data centers of the world. Japan has leading companies in automation and robotics. They export 50% of the global robotics. And those companies are called FANUC and 𝗬𝗃, but they also have semiconductor testing equipment, materials companies like carbon fiber. So Japan, although, as I said earlier on, is not probably a tiger, it is very well placed, I think, to benefit from some of these drivers we're seeing over the next sort of 10 to 20 years.
Right. Thank you, Oliver. So I think I have a next question for 𝗲𝘃. So following up on the previous question where we touched on technology, and of course, just now my colleague shared about semiconductors. So since semiconductors are essentially the bedrock for technological advancements, do you think it is important for a country to be a leader in the semiconductor space?
So I think being a leader in the semiconductor space would be a sufficient reason to lead to very strong growth within the economy, but it's not the only reason where a country can therefore get strong growth. So assuming you are an economy who has access to semiconductors, and also provided you have the right policies, infrastructure, and workforce in place, then yes, semiconductor would be a strong reason that can help your economy to grow. But there's, within the value chain, there are so many different parts of the supply chain where economies can actually value add and therefore find their strengths in. So I think importantly, we have to, the key thing for countries or economies is that they have to play to their strengths. They have to really find where they actually can offer a competitive edge compared to other economies, and that's where they stand out and therefore can achieve sustainable growth. So take, for example, right now, AI is dubbed as the next technological revolution. So economies who are strong at that, take China, for example, they can therefore get or receive a huge source of growth from being strong in AI. And I think another important point or interesting point to highlight is that being strong in semiconductors doesn't mean it would naturally lead to good growth, because it also subjects you to quite a lot of volatility, because you are vulnerable to global demand and also the chip cycle as well.
Right, interesting answers and questions for the other countries. So I think let's end off with a last question for Kenny. So let's talk about home ground, Singapore. What do you think are some of the opportunities and growth ahead?
Yeah, I think Singapore, it has been an Asian tiger. We have experienced, past era of very, very high economic growth. Of course, right now, is on a more difficult patch. But having said that, I think the kind of foundation that Singapore has laid itself, I think it's important why I chose Singapore as a new Asian tiger. I think first of all, if you were to look at the current account surplus, which I actually mentioned, Singapore current account surplus is one of the most enviable in the world. You have double digit consistently for the past 2 decades or so. I think the difficult patch was in the early 80s, but after that, we have been saving up a lot of money. And I think Singapore also know its limitation, that we don't have a vast amount of land, we don't have a lot of cheap skilled labor. So to compete itself in the manufacturing space is kind of like going to be tough, and I don't think it's sustainable. So what it has been embarking itself on is firstly on its role and status as a global financial center. I think that has been proven, that Singapore has successfully grown itself, to be in the league of Tokyo, New York, London, Hong Kong. And again, I think this is something that I think the government has been using very proactive policy to basically encourage the continuing growth and expansion of this sector. And you can see some of the policies that they have implemented. And recently, because of the, of the concern in China, there has been a lot of wealth kind of relocation to other parts of the world. And Singapore has been one of the beneficiaries. Just some data for your perspective. Like, the Asian single family office, in 3 years ago, in 2020, there were only 400 in Singapore. And as of the latest data that we got, we already surpassed 1,100. So there has been a strong growth in terms of this wealth. And Singapore is also attracting a lot of foreign institutional money. The total AUM that we are managing is now $5.6 trillion. And this is the number from MAS. So I think that kind of growth in the financial center will continue, and the government will continue to proactively encourage that. And I think that will be important kind of area that we have to look at in Singapore. The other aspect of Singapore, which Singapore also understand that it has to diversify itself away from just over-reliance on a particular sector. So they have been also embarking on what I would call a new Singapore opportunities. So you look at, although it's not very well represented in the stock market at this point in time, but new opportunities in the space of technology, in the space of, for example, you've seen the first electric car that is actually being produced in Singapore, right? Or assembled in Singapore in that regards. And I think it's the Hyundai Ioniq, if I'm not wrong. And then also in areas of healthcare, in areas of data, in areas of logistics. So a lot of you will ask, let's say for your children, let's say if they go to the university, which is the best course that they choose that is the highest paying? Data science, data analytics. So this is something that, the Singapore is also trying to upgrade the skill set of its people so that they can actually be engaged in what we have seen in the other parts of the world where technology progress is very important, as shared by some of our fellow panelists. So I think these are some of the new initiatives that Singapore, which kind of give me a bit of confidence that we will continue to sustain our status as the Asian tiger.
Right. Thank you, Kenny. So, Asia, Singapore, and a lot of the countries that our panelists have explained, there are a lot of opportunities ahead. So, do look out for them in the years to come. I think with that, we've come to the end of the discussion today. Thank you, everyone, for your attention, and of course, to our panel speakers.